Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. Have you ever wondered if something could reach out from the past just to speak to you? It was a rainy afternoon when I first found it. The kind of rain that taps on the window, a constant rhythm that makes the world outside seem distant, as if you're living in another place entirely. I was sorting through boxes in the attic, things I hadn't touched since moving in months ago. Most of it was junk, relics of previous tenants, old furniture, dusty photo albums, clothes that smelled of mothballs, but something caught my eye. A book. It wasn't particularly old, nor was it remarkable in appearance. It was a thick leather-bound book, the kind you might find on a shelf in a forgotten corner of a second-hand bookstore. The cover was smooth, dark brown, with no title, no markings. Just a simple piece of worn leather. But it felt different. It seemed to call to me somehow. Something about it tugged at me, even as I sat there with it in my hands, a slight chill crawling up my spine. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity won out. I opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, fragile but not falling apart. I flicked through them, finding strange, almost cryptic symbols scattered across the pages. But none of it made sense. The words weren't like anything I'd ever seen, some ancient language I couldn't decipher. Then, as I turned the page, I heard it. A faint sound, a whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps my imagination running wild. But no, it was coming from the book. I stopped, holding my breath. The room was eerily silent, save for the rain tapping gently on the roof. And then it came again. A soft, almost inaudible whisper. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper seemed to rise and fall, like the voice was struggling to be heard, trying to form words from the depths of the pages. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it was unmistakable. The sound was too real. It was too close. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Without thinking, I turned the page again. The whisper grew louder, and this time I could swear it was trying to form a sentence. The words were faint, but they're distorted, like they were being muffled by the pages themselves. And then, as if it had been waiting for me, the whisper finally spoke. Read it out loud. I recoiled, my body tense with fear. My hands shook as I held the book. Was this real? Was I hearing things? Or was something in this book alive? I stared at the page in front of me. The words seemed to swirl before my eyes, as if they were moving on their own, rearranging. Something compelled me to read them aloud. Something deep inside me, urging me to follow the command. Read it out loud, the voice repeated, this time clearer. I tried to resist. I wanted to close the book, to shut it away and forget about it. But my mouth betrayed me, and before I could stop myself, the words escaped my lips. The shadows are always watching. The moment I spoke, the whisper stopped. Silence. And then, the room seemed to shift. I glanced around, my heart racing in my chest. The shadows in the corners of the attic seemed to deepen, stretching out, crawling toward me, as if they had been waiting for that very moment. The air grew colder, the space feeling smaller, more confined. I could feel something moving in the silence, something unseen, but undeniably present. A sudden crash from downstairs snapped me out of my daze. My body tensed, the blood rushing to my ears, my senses on high alert. But when I looked down, the book was still open in my hands, the words now written in ink that seemed to glisten faintly in the dim light. I could feel it, something had changed. I closed the book quickly, as if it might somehow escape if I didn't. But I could still hear it, the whisper. Louder this time, almost mocking. You shouldn't have read it. I felt the weight of those words press against me, and for the first time, I realized that I had crossed a line. The book wasn't just a collection of old pages, it was a doorway, and whatever was on the other side was not something I wanted to face. I left the attic, closing the door behind me, but the whisper followed. It echoed in my ears, relentless, growing louder with each step I took. Read it out loud. And for reasons I couldn't understand, I felt an overwhelming need to obey. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, tried to ignore the compulsion, but I couldn't. The book was no longer just a book. It was something much darker. Something that was waiting for me to open it again. To read it again. And I wasn't sure I could stop myself. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that something had changed the moment I closed the book. The whisper lingered in my mind, like a song I couldn't forget, the words echoing over and over in my thoughts. I hadn't planned to go back. I promised myself I'd forget about it, leave it locked away in the attic where it belonged. But the pull was too strong. Every time I tried to move on, the whisper came back, soft at first, but insistent, growing louder. By the time night fell, I couldn't resist anymore. The darkness outside seemed to close in, and the book, it called to me, as if it were alive, as if it were waiting. My fingers trembled as I grabbed it from the shelf where I had placed it earlier. I couldn't look away. The words, like a magnet, drew me in, and I felt myself walking back toward the attic. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. It was late, and I knew I shouldn't be up here, but something inside me pushed forward. I had to know what the book wanted. I had to understand. I made my way back to the dusty attic, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. As soon as I stepped inside, the whisper began again. Faint at first, like a soft breeze brushing against my ear. But the moment I opened the book, it grew louder. Read it out loud, it urged. I hesitated. My mind screamed for me to stop, but my hands betrayed me. I could feel the words on the page, like they were meant to be spoken, like they were begging me to say them aloud. With a trembling breath, I read the first line, "The shadows are always watching." The whisper ceased. For a brief moment, the silence felt oppressive, like the very air around me had become heavier. Then, from the corner of the room, I saw it, a figure, barely visible in the dim light. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but it was still there, lurking just beyond the shadows. A shape, shifting, never fully coming into view. I couldn't breathe. My body froze, caught between the instinct to run and the need to understand. The figure moved slightly, and the whisper returned, this time different, more menacing. You should never have read it. You are ours now. A chill ran down my spine. I slammed the book shut, but the whisper didn't stop. It echoed in the room, in my mind, as if it had been there all along. The shape in the corner of the room grew clearer now, its outline sharper. I could see something, but not enough to make out what it was. It wasn't human. Not in any way I understood. Leave now, I whispered to myself, backing away slowly. But the figure stepped forward, and I felt the air grow colder. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a voice. "Don't go." I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. But there was no one there. The house was silent again, save for the faint tapping of the rain against the windows. But the voice, it had been real. I could feel the weight of it in my chest, the presence of something behind me. "Read it out loud," the voice commanded, not from the book this time, but from somewhere behind me. I turned around quickly, but saw nothing. I had to leave. I had to get out of that attic, out of this house, before whatever was coming for me found me. But my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped by the unseen force that surrounded me. The whisper grew louder, more frantic, more desperate. "Read it out loud. You cannot stop now." I felt my breath quicken. The words. I couldn't stop myself from saying them. "Read it out loud," I muttered under my breath, as if I were a puppet moving without control. And then everything changed. The room shifted, as though the walls were stretching, warping, and I could feel the very fabric of reality bending around me. The shadows on the floor grew long, reaching toward me, wrapping around my feet like hands pulling me down. A scream bubbled up in my throat, but no sound came out. I was drowning in the silence, swallowed by the darkness that enveloped me. The voice spoke again, clearer now, but with an unnatural, almost chilling calm. "You belong to us now." I dropped the book. It fell to the floor with a thud, and as it did, the whisper stopped. The air felt still again, as if the whole world had frozen in place. I stood there, trembling, unsure of what had just happened. The room was empty now, no figure, no shadows moving. Everything appeared normal, as if nothing had changed. But I knew it had. The book was gone. And I wasn't alone anymore. The house was eerily quiet. No whisper, no figure, no sound at all. But I knew. I knew that something had changed, that something had shifted in the fabric of reality around me. The book was gone, but the presence, it lingered. I stood in the attic, my heart racing, my breath shallow. The weight in the air was palpable, like a storm cloud pressing in from all sides, suffocating me with its heaviness. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, darker, as though they were watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I had to leave. I had to escape. But my legs felt like stone, rooted in place by some unseen force. I tried to shake off the paralyzing fear that gripped me. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that the room was as it had always been. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something in this house, something ancient and dark, and it was not going to let me go. I stumbled backward, my fingers brushing against the dusty shelves as I tried to make my way toward the door. The house creaked as though the very structure was shifting around me, groaning under some terrible weight. Suddenly, the floorboards behind me groaned. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. The room was still empty. Yet, the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. I wasn't alone. The whisper began again. Soft, like a breath against my ear. "You can't leave." I froze. The voice wasn't from the book this time. It was in my head, inside my thoughts. I could hear it clearly, as if it were speaking directly to me. "Why are you still here?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Who are you?" The silence that followed felt thick, suffocating. Then, the voice answered, its tone low and insistent. "You called us." I shook my head, confusion swirling inside me. "No. I didn't. I never meant to." "You called us," the voice repeated, louder this time. "You opened the door." I didn't understand. What door? What had I done? I stumbled toward the stairs, desperate to escape, but the house felt like it was closing in on me. The walls seemed to lean in, the air growing dense and cold. The whisper was all around me now, circling, pressing in, as if the very house itself was alive. With a final burst of panic, I rushed down the stairs, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the front door. I flung it open, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I stepped outside, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the house, feeling the pull to return, to understand what was happening. But no matter how much I wanted to, I knew I couldn't go back. The house, the book, whatever was in there, it had me. It had marked me. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it again. The whisper. Faint, but unmistakable. Not so fast. I whipped around, my heart stopping in my chest. There, on the doorstep, lying in the shadows, was the book. Its cover was cracked, the pages slightly worn, but it was unmistakable. The same book. The one I had thrown down in the attic. It shouldn't be here. It couldn't be here. With shaking hands, I reached down and picked it up. The moment my fingers touched the cover, a wave of nausea hit me. The presence inside the book seemed to swell, like a black cloud filling my mind. "Open it," the voice urged. "Read it aloud." I felt sick. I didn't want to. I knew that if I opened it again, I would be pulled back into whatever nightmare had begun. But the compulsion was too strong. The whisper, it was irresistible. I had no choice but to open it. The pages seemed to turn on their own, as though they were eager to be read. And then, the words jumped out at me, glowing faintly in the dim light. "You cannot escape. You belong to us now. The story has just begun." I couldn't breathe. The words felt like they were branded onto my soul. And just like that, I realized the truth. The book wasn't just a book. It was a trap. I stood there, frozen, the book open in my hands. The words glowed like a burning brand, searing themselves into my memory. I wanted to drop it, to throw it as far as I could, but my hands wouldn't obey me. The weight of the book felt unbearable, like it was tethered to me by an invisible force. I couldn't escape. The whispering had stopped, but the presence was still there, surrounding me, heavy and oppressive. The air seemed to thicken, the shadows around me stretching longer, curling like fingers ready to grab me. Why can't I leave?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The book didn't respond. It didn't need to. Its very existence was the answer. I had opened it, had called something forth, something that wouldn't let me go. I was trapped in its pages, in its story, and no matter how hard I tried, there was no escaping it. I took a step back, still holding the book, my heart racing. The house behind me seemed to loom, its windows like black eyes staring down at me. I knew the whispers would come again. They were patient. They would wait until I was vulnerable, until I made a mistake. And then they would return. I had to get rid of the book. I couldn't keep it. But where would I go? What would I do? I looked down at the darkened pages, the words almost pulsing beneath my fingertips. Open it, they seemed to say, but I refused. I didn't want to read anymore. I didn't want to be a part of whatever this was. I stumbled back into the house, slamming the door behind me, trying to shut out the feeling of suffocation that had taken hold of me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt as though the house itself was closing in on me, as though every wall, every floorboard, every corner was conspiring to keep me here. In a frenzy, I started pacing. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. The book was the key, but it also seemed to be the lock. Every time I tried to get rid of it, it found its way back into my hands. I had to destroy it. But how? I placed the book down on the table, my fingers lingering on the edges. For a moment, there was silence. Then, I heard it. The whisper. Soft, like a breath, so faint that I almost thought I imagined it. But there it was again, louder this time. You can't escape. I gripped the edge of the table, the words echoing in my head. I can't escape, I repeated to myself, as if saying it aloud could make it true. But I wasn't sure if that was the case. What if the book itself was the only way out? What if it was a curse, a trap that I couldn't avoid? I ran my fingers across the pages, hoping for some answer, some clue. It was then that I noticed something strange. The words weren't just glowing, they were changing. As if they were alive, shifting, rewriting themselves with every passing second. You are part of the story now. I recoiled in horror. The words had formed an eerie message, but that wasn't the worst part. It was the feeling that accompanied them. The sensation that the book was watching me, waiting for me to make a choice. Without thinking, I slammed the book shut. The room grew colder, the silence thicker. I was suffocating. The weight of the book in my hands was unbearable, like a burden too heavy to carry. I backed away from the table, dropping the book onto the floor. It lay there, still, silent, but I knew better than to believe it was done with me. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, the air even colder. I turned and ran. Down the hall, through the kitchen, out the back door, into the yard. I didn't stop to look back, didn't stop to think. I had to get away. I had to find a way to break free. But the book followed me. I heard the footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. I turned quickly, and there, lying in the grass, was the book. It had followed me outside, appearing out of nowhere, like it was drawn to me, like it was part of me. Open it, the voice whispered again. I dropped to my knees, hands shaking, heart pounding. The wind picked up, blowing through the trees, carrying with it the scent of something ancient, something wrong. The book seemed to pulse with energy, its presence undeniable. It wasn't just a book. It was a gateway. To what? I didn't know. But I couldn't let it control me anymore. I couldn't let it pull me in. I reached down, grabbing the book, and with all my strength, I hurled it into the fire pit in the middle of the yard. The flames roared to life, licking at the book's edges, but they didn't consume it. Instead, the book began to glow brighter, casting an eerie light across the yard. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me from every direction. I turned and ran, but the heat of the fire was closing in, the whispers growing into a deafening roar. And then, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, as though the earth itself had opened up to swallow me whole. I awoke with a start, the ground hard beneath me. The fire pit, the book, The whispers, they were gone. For a moment, I thought I had imagined everything. But the air felt different, as though something was still pressing down on me, something that I couldn't see but could feel. I pushed myself up, my hands trembling. The sky was dark, but the stars seemed to shimmer strangely, as if they too were watching me. I was still in the yard, but everything felt wrong. The house behind me loomed, its windows like empty eyes. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see the remnants of the book, the scorch marks from where I had thrown it. But there was nothing. No ashes. No chart pages. It was as if the book had never existed, as if it had vanished entirely. I took a step forward, still unsure of what was happening. The yard seemed endless now, the trees bending toward me like they were alive, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The grass underfoot was soft, too soft, like it was swallowing my footsteps. The whispers started again. Soft, barely audible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. They were everywhere, coming from all directions, surrounding me, filling the air with a sense of urgency. It was like the whispers were calling to me, beckoning me back, but I didn't want to listen. I couldn't. But then, something changed. The whispers stopped, and I heard something else. A voice. It was my voice, but it wasn't. It was distorted, like an echo of something that shouldn't exist. I froze, trying to make sense of it. "Open it," the voice said, mimicking the words I had heard earlier. "Open the book." I turned, my eyes scanning the yard. There, in the center of the grass, was the book. It had returned. The same book, as pristine as ever, resting on the ground in front of me. I took a step back, heart racing. No. I couldn't do this again. I couldn't open it. I had thrown it away. I had tried to escape. But the voice wouldn't let me go. It was pulling me in, wrapping itself around my mind, drowning out all other thoughts. "Open it," it repeated, louder now, insistent. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was trapped in this place, in this moment, with the book before me. It was like the universe had become a twisted version of itself, and there was no way out. I slowly crouched down, my fingers brushing the edges of the book. The moment I touched it, the ground beneath me seemed to shift. The world around me blurred, and for a brief moment, I thought I was falling again, as though the earth was swallowing me whole. But then, everything stopped. The whispers, the voice, the feeling of being pulled under, it all stopped. I opened the book. The pages turned on their own, each one flipping faster than I could follow. The words on the pages were no longer readable, no longer even in a language I understood. They shifted, morphing into shapes and symbols, into something far beyond human comprehension. I felt a sudden pressure in my chest, like something was trying to burst out from inside me. The words seemed to come alive, wrapping themselves around my thoughts, twisting them into a knot of confusion and terror. And then, I heard it. A voice, clear and unmistakable. It wasn't my voice. It was hers. "Don't open it," my mother's voice said, a soft whisper filled with warning and regret. "You don't know what you're doing." I froze. I knew that voice. I knew it better than anything. It had been years since I last heard it, but it was unmistakable. My mother. I slammed the book shut, but it didn't stop. The voice continued, louder now, growing frantic, desperate. "Don't open it. Don't let it take you. It's too late. You can't go back. I dropped the book, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The yard around me began to warp, the trees twisting like shadows, the ground beneath me buckling and cracking. The sky turned a sickly red, and I could feel the weight of something pressing down on me, something ancient, something powerful. Please, my mother's voice whispered again, and this time it was filled with tears. Please. The world was collapsing, falling into darkness. And then, the last thing I heard was a deafening silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of pages turning. I don't know what made me go down there. It wasn't even my intention at first. I was just trying to cut through, shortcut, they always say. The day had been long, and the air felt heavy with the weight of a coming storm. The clouds above, thick and dark, seemed to press against the buildings around me, the noise of the city muffled, as though the world had been swallowed by a thick blanket. I stood at the entrance of the underground passageway, the kind that connects one side of the street to the other. It was almost empty. A few people passed by in the distance, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. I hesitated for a moment, the cold concrete of the walls before me looking much darker than I remembered. But I needed to get to the other side quickly. I stepped inside. The first few steps were nothing out of the ordinary. The air was stale, a mixture of dampness and dust, but nothing that would make anyone think twice. The lights overhead flickered faintly, casting soft, uneven shadows. A few discarded items littered the floor, a crushed soda can, a crumpled paper bag, a forgotten umbrella. The scent of cheap coffee lingered in the air. But something felt off. I couldn't place it at first. Maybe it was just the day, maybe it was just the sudden change in atmosphere. The noise of the city was gone now, replaced by the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights. It was like stepping into a void, a space where time didn't seem to matter. I kept walking. A few more steps. Then, I noticed it, the first change. The path seemed to stretch further than I remembered, the walls narrowing just a little bit. I shrugged it off, assuming it was my mind playing tricks. But then the sounds around me changed. It wasn't just the hum of the lights anymore. In the far distance, faint but clear, there was a soft sound. A scratching, like something dragging along the ground. My heart skipped a beat, but I dismissed it. It must have been the pipes or the old building settling. Yet, the sound continued, rhythmic, almost deliberate. And there was something else, too. The air, which had already been cold, seemed to grow colder as I moved deeper into the passage. A faint draft blew through the narrow space, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I stopped. The silence around me was suddenly oppressive. I was certain I hadn't been walking for more than a few minutes, but the passage felt longer than it should. The walls, those dull, gray walls, looked somehow different now. More jagged, like they were closing in around me. The lights above flickered again, their glow dimming slightly before returning to normal. The scratching sound was closer now, unmistakable. It wasn't just a random noise. It was something deliberate, something following me. I turned around quickly, but all I saw was the same dimly lit passage behind me. There was nothing there. Nothing but the endless corridor stretching into darkness. I took a deep breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. I wasn't going to let a little noise stop me. Not now. I needed to get out of here. I took a few more steps forward, But as I did, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The walls, they were shifting. The edges of the passage were slowly bending in, like the tunnel was compressing. My stomach dropped. I didn't know how to explain it, but I could feel the space around me warping, as if the world was quietly reshaping itself without my consent. The end was supposed to be ahead, just a few more steps, but now it felt farther away. I tried to take another step, but my foot hit something soft. Something wet. I looked down, but before I could process it, the faint sound of footsteps reached my ears, clear now, close, coming from behind me. I turned around sharply. Nothing. But then, just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, a shadow moved at the far end of the tunnel. At first, I thought it was just the dim light playing tricks on my eyes. But no! This was something real. It was a figure, standing motionless, shrouded in darkness, its outline barely visible. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. But I felt its presence, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I took a step back. The space around me seemed to shrink with every passing second, as if the passage itself was alive and eager to swallow me whole. The scratching sound grew louder, faster now, and suddenly I wasn't sure whether it was me moving or the passage that was shifting. I reached for my phone, desperate for a signal, anything. But the screen stayed black. No bars. No connection. The footsteps behind me had stopped. And then, the shadow moved. I didn't think. I didn't have time to think. My body moved before my mind could catch up. My feet pushed me forward, not sure whether I was trying to outrun the shadow or simply escape the feeling of being trapped. But the passage ahead, what I thought was the way out, seemed to stretch farther, the walls narrowing, bending at angles that felt impossible. It was as though the very tunnel itself was refusing to let me go. Every step I took, the air grew colder, heavier. The silence had turned into something suffocating, and my heartbeat seemed louder than anything else. I glanced back. The shadow was gone, but I didn't trust the stillness. It felt wrong. The hairs on my neck prickled, and I could almost hear the distant shuffle of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as though someone, or something, was trailing me from just out of sight. The sound was subtle, but it was there, always there, growing closer the longer I stayed. I quickened my pace, the sound of my shoes on the concrete echoing unnervingly in the confined space. The lights above flickered again, casting long, jittery shadows that danced along the walls like the movements of something alive. Something watching. The tunnel was no longer just a space I was passing through. It was changing, shifting around me. The corners that had once seemed sharp now blurred into one another, creating a maze of indistinct passageways. Every turn felt like a mistake. No matter how far I walked, the exit never came. The farther I went, the more the passage seemed to close in on me. Then, just as I thought I had lost all sense of direction, I saw something. A door. No, not a door, more like a gap, an opening in the wall just ahead. It didn't look like the rest of the passage. The edges were jagged, uneven. I couldn't remember seeing it when I had first entered, but now it was there, waiting. A strange, almost magnetic pull urged me toward it. Maybe it was an exit. Or maybe it was something else. I stepped forward, but as I approached the opening, something shifted. The floor beneath me trembled, and the sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, clearer. I spun around, my pulse quickening. The space behind me, where I had come from, was now shrouded in thick, suffocating darkness. I could no longer see the far end of the tunnel. The path I had walked was now a black void. A cold breath brushed against the back of my neck. I froze. It was there. Whatever it was. I could feel it. I could feel its presence, closing in on me, its unseen form moving closer, almost deliberately. I didn't know what to do. The door, the opening, was right there. It looked like a way out, but was it? Or was it just another trick? Another false hope that would lead me deeper into this nightmare? But I couldn't just stand there, waiting to be consumed by whatever was behind me. I moved toward the opening, my every step heavy, like I was walking through a thick fog. The scratching sound grew louder, more frantic. It was right behind me now. I could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, too close, too real. I reached the gap in the wall. My hands were shaking as I placed them against the rough edges, pushing myself through. I felt a sharp pain on my arm as I scraped against the jagged stone. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself through the gap. But as soon as I did, I realized something. There was no other side. There was no exit. The space I had entered was just more tunnel, more darkness, more of the same. I had stepped into a new section, yes, but there was no escape. The walls around me seemed to close in even more now, the passage compressing with every breath I took. The scratching sound was deafening. It was right there. The footsteps, closer. Closer. I turned to look, but all I saw was the darkness. It consumed everything. I couldn't even make out the faintest outline of the figure anymore. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to move back through the gap I had come from, but the opening was gone. It had closed up, swallowed by the stone. I was trapped. There was no way out. I was alone in the dark. But I wasn't truly alone, was I? I could still feel it. The presence. The eyes. They were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. And all I could hear were the footsteps, getting closer. I needed to keep moving. I needed to find a way out. But the deeper I went, the more the passage seemed to distort. The walls twisted in on themselves, the lights flickered, and the air grew so cold I could see my breath. And then, just as I was about to turn around and run again, I heard something new. A whisper. It was faint at first, like a breath in the dark. But it grew louder, clearer, until it was unmistakable. Stay. I froze. The voice was chilling, echoing through the passage like it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I turned toward the voice. Nothing. And then, in the distance, something moved. Something huge, something darker than the shadows themselves. It was coming. And it wasn't alone. The whisper echoed in my ears, the words stay reverberating in my mind as if it had been carved into my very soul. I could feel its weight, a cold, invisible hand pressing against my chest, forcing me to stop. To listen. But I couldn't. I had to keep moving. The path behind me had already swallowed the last trace of light, and ahead, the shadows stretched, unbroken, swallowing everything. The footsteps, the scratching, they were relentless now, growing louder, faster. I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel it, the presence, closing in. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, but the air had turned thick. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was oppressive, like something heavy was pressing down on me, squeezing the very air from my lungs. I stumbled, gasping, as the walls around me seemed to shift again, bending in on themselves, narrowing the passage further. I could still hear the whisper. It wasn't words anymore. It was something else, something guttural, like the sound of something ancient, something that didn't belong here. It echoed from all sides, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. Suddenly, I heard a loud crack. The ground beneath me trembled. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. A shadow darted across the far wall, too fast for my eyes to follow, and then another. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps anymore. It was movement. The walls weren't just closing in, they were alive. I turned, searching for some kind of escape, but all I saw was more of the same. More of the endless, twisting passage. The lights above flickered once more, and for a moment they went out entirely, plunging me into complete darkness. I stumbled forward, hands reaching out in front of me, but there was no ground beneath me. No walls to steady me. I felt myself falling deeper into the void. The scratching sound was there again, closer, like someone was right behind me, just inches away. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, swallowed by the crushing silence. Then, the lights blinked back on. But it wasn't the same passage. It was different now. The walls were gone, replaced by an open expanse, a cavernous space that stretched out in all directions. There were no doors, no exits. Just a vast, empty void, like I had stepped into some alternate world. And in the center of this place, I saw it. The figure. It stood motionless, shrouded in shadow, its form barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't tell what it was, human, creature, something else entirely, but I felt it. The presence. It wasn't just watching me anymore, it was waiting. I could feel it now, pressing in on me from every direction, like the air had thickened into something solid, suffocating. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place. The whisper came again, louder this time, but it wasn't a word. It was a sound, something deep, something primal, like a growl. I turned to run, but the space shifted once more. The walls, no, the floor, beneath me seemed to twist, folding in on themselves, forming a maze of corridors that didn't make sense. I was trapped again. No matter which way I turned, I found myself back in the same place. The figure was still there, standing motionless, and yet I felt its eyes, its presence, shifting, moving, following me. I took a deep breath and steadied myself. I couldn't let it take me. I couldn't let the fear control me. Not now. Not yet. I ran. My feet slapped against the cold floor, echoing through the cavernous space. The sound of my own footsteps mixed with the relentless scratching, the whispering growls. The space around me twisted with every step I took. The walls no longer felt like walls, they felt like a living thing, closing in, suffocating me. The more I ran, the more I became disoriented. The path kept changing, the walls bending, until I had no idea which direction I was going. And then, I saw it. Another door. But this one wasn't like the others. It was different. It was solid, a real door, not a gap or an illusion. It was heavy, metallic, and unlike anything I had seen before. My hand reached out, trembling, as I approached it, but the moment my fingers brushed the cold surface, something sharp pricked my skin. I pulled back, but the door remained where it was, silent. The footsteps stopped. The scratching ceased. The whisper fell away into an unnatural silence. I felt something shift behind me, like a breath against my ear, but when I turned around, the figure was gone. The space had returned to its eerie, empty stillness, but I knew it wasn't over. It was still there, somewhere, watching. I placed my hand on the door again, but this time I felt a pull, an undeniable force urging me forward. The metal was cold, but it didn't hurt. It was different this time. The door was calling to me. I could hear it, feel it, deep in my bones. It was the only way. With a final, shaky breath, I pushed the door open. The door creaked open, slowly, with a groan that reverberated through the emptiness around me. The silence stretched, almost unbearable, as if the air itself held its breath. I couldn't tell if it was fear or the oppressive weight of the space, but the moment I stepped through, a wave of cold hit me, colder than anything I had felt before. I blinked, adjusting to the dim, eerie light that filtered through the new space. It wasn't the same tunnel anymore. No longer was I in the confines of a narrow underground passage. I had stepped into something far worse. The walls here weren't made of concrete or stone, they were alive. Veins pulsed beneath the surface, glowing faintly, like something organic, breathing. The air was thick with a metallic scent, sharp and cloying. Every step I took echoed, but the sound felt muffled, swallowed by the strange, pulsating hum of the space. I looked around, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But it was impossible. The room seemed to stretch into infinity in all directions. It was vast, too vast, with no ceiling, no clear walls. Just an endless expanse of shifting, organic matter, bathed in the same cold, sickly light. And then I heard it again. The whisper. But this time, it wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, more tangible than ever. It filled the space, vibrating in my bones, wrapping around my mind. It wasn't speaking to me in words anymore. It was showing me things. Flashes, fragments of images, of movements. Faces twisted in pain, lost in the dark. Endless corridors, some familiar, some alien. And always the sound of scratching, of footsteps. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was heavier now, oppressive, as though it was pressing down on me from all sides. I had no idea where I was, or how I had gotten here. I couldn't even remember how long I had been trapped in that passage. Time seemed to blur, to bend, to lose meaning. The walls pulsed again, their fleshy texture shifting, throbbing like a living heart. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. My breath came out in invisible clouds, a fog of panic rising around me. I looked around frantically. The figure, whatever it was gone, but I could still feel its presence, lurking, just out of reach. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, gnawed at me from every direction. I had to move. I had to get out of here. But every path seemed to lead me in circles. I tried to walk forward, but the ground beneath me wasn't solid. It shifted, like I was walking on a surface that was constantly changing, breathing, alive. I could feel it under my feet, like the very ground was shifting to keep me from finding an escape. I turned back. The door I had just come through was gone. Vanished. I stood in the center of the vast, pulsing space, the walls bending inward, closing in on me, but there was nowhere to run. No way out. The scratching was louder now, a frantic noise that filled the air, and the footsteps, so many footsteps, were following me, always just behind, never too far. And then I saw it. A figure. Just like before. But this time, it wasn't standing still. It was moving. Slowly. Methodically. The outline was distorted, shifting, its form almost human but twisted, like something wrong. I couldn't look away, couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, every part of me frozen, caught in its gaze, or was it my mind playing tricks on me? The whisper came again, but now it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of voices, overlapping, whispering words I couldn't understand, all at once. The pressure in the air increased, the temperature dropping even further, until I could feel the icy cold bite into my skin, my fingertips turning numb. I turned to run, but the space was different. The walls had shifted again, closing in tighter, narrower. I couldn't tell where I was going. There was no up, no down. The ground was shifting beneath me, and the walls, the ceiling, they all seemed to be breathing, pulsing, wrapping around me like a terrible living thing. I ran in a blind panic, but every step I took brought me deeper into the maze. Every direction seemed to lead to the same place. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the footsteps, they were right behind me now. Close. So close I could hear the scrape of something sharp against the ground, the soft shuffle of movement that was both human and not. And then, through the darkness, a faint light appeared. I wasn't sure if it was real, if it was another illusion, but I had to try. I pushed forward, my feet moving faster, my heart pounding. The figure was still behind me, growing closer with every passing second. I reached the light, my hand outstretched, ready to push through whatever barrier it was. But as my fingers brushed against it, the light flickered and died. For a moment, everything went black. I couldn't hear the whispers anymore. I couldn't feel the presence. It was like I had been plunged into total, suffocating darkness. And then, the whisper came again. But this time, it wasn't a voice. It was a scream. A scream so loud, so filled with agony, that it pierced through me, ripped through the silence like a knife. It was the scream of someone trapped, someone desperate, someone like me. I screamed back, but there was no sound. Just the deep, echoing silence. And then, the light returned. The light flickered back on, and for a moment, I thought it was over. I thought I had found the way out. But the moment my eyes adjusted, I realized how wrong I was. The space around me had changed again, no longer that dark, twisted expanse I had wandered through. It was worse. The walls were no longer pulsating, but the ground was slick with something wet, something unnatural. The air smelled of decay. The light above me was dim, flickering like the last remnants of a dying star, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the gloom. The whispering had stopped. The footsteps had gone silent. But there was a presence. A suffocating weight in the air, like something ancient was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I looked around, my pulse racing, but the more I searched, the more I realized there was no exit. No doors. No paths leading anywhere. The walls were smooth, cold, and featureless, closing me in with every breath I took. The silence stretched on. I couldn't breathe. Then, I felt it again, the soft, almost imperceptible shift in the air, like a cold breeze, but colder. It was wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. The ground beneath me trembled. It was subtle at first, like a distant rumble, but it grew. Stronger. The floor cracked, splitting open, and from the darkness below, I saw a shadow. It wasn't a figure anymore. It was a shape, a mass, dark and formless, rising from the cracks in the floor like smoke, slowly twisting upward. and with it came the sound. A low, guttural growl unlike anything I had ever heard. It was so deep, so primal, that I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through me, shaking me to my core. I stepped back, but the space didn't allow me to move. I was trapped. The shadow continued to rise, forming a shape, something large, something terrifying, but I couldn't quite make out what it was. Its presence filled the space, blocking out the light, casting everything in an impenetrable darkness. The whisper came again. Not a word. Not a voice. But a feeling. A pull. It was as if the very air was calling to me, urging me forward, urging me to stay. I couldn't. I had to get out. I had to survive. I turned to run, but the walls shifted again. They weren't just walls anymore. They were like tendrils, twisting and reaching, wrapping around me, closing in. I couldn't escape. I couldn't breathe. The shadow was almost fully formed now. Its shape was grotesque, unnatural, like a creature born of darkness and despair. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly in the dark, two pinpricks of light staring into me, through me. I fell to my knees. My breath was shallow, ragged. My mind raced. There was nowhere to go. No way out. The tunnel had changed me. It had consumed me, piece by piece. And now, the end was here. It was here, waiting. I could feel its eyes on me, could feel its breath, cold, fetid, on my skin. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was inside my head, inside my mind. I heard its voice, not in words, but in the darkest parts of my consciousness, in the deepest fears I had tried to bury. It whispered of endings, of lost souls, of forever. I could barely breathe. I could barely think. The world around me had become a blur, a nightmare that I couldn't escape. And just as the shadow loomed over me, its grip tightening, its form swallowing me whole, I realized the truth. There had never been a way out. There had never been an exit. I had been trapped from the very beginning. The tunnel was no longer just a place. It was everything. The walls, the darkness, the whispers, they were all part of it. Part of me. Part of my mind, my soul. There was no escape. No salvation. The tunnel was my prison, and it always would be. The last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was my own scream. But it didn't sound like my voice. It sounded wrong. Twisted. Like it came from somewhere else. And then, silence. Have you ever felt like you're going in the wrong direction, but can't explain why? It was a quiet evening, the kind of evening where everything feels calm. I was driving home, my mind wandering through the usual routine of the day, when something strange caught my attention. It was a road I didn't recognize. I had driven down this street countless times, a shortcut I took every evening on my way home. The familiar landmarks had always been the same row of trees by the old gas station, the same diner with the neon sign that flickered late into the night. I could drive it with my eyes closed, my mind so accustomed to the route that I didn't even need to think. But that evening, as I came around the bend, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. A turn I had never seen before. It was subtle at first, almost easy to miss. But the signpost, hidden just off to the side of the road, was clear enough. The turn led down a narrow, dimly lit path that I could have sworn wasn't there yesterday. I slowed down, instinctively, my curiosity gnawing at me. The urge to take that turn was overpowering, despite how odd it felt. I hadn't planned on detouring. I was tired, ready to go home. But something about that road tugged at me, a quiet pull that I couldn't ignore. It was like a whisper, soft but persistent, urging me to turn. And so I did. The moment my tires left the familiar pavement and the car began to roll down that unfamiliar path, I immediately felt a shift. The air felt heavier, as though the world itself was pressing in on me. The streetlights above flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the road. The atmosphere felt wrong, but I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I was overreacting. The road was winding, tighter than I expected, forcing me to slow down. I kept my eyes on the pavement, the sound of the tires against the asphalt echoing in the quiet night. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. But there was no one, of course. At least, I thought there wasn't. The trees around me seemed to grow denser, their branches stretching overhead like arms, blocking out what little light the street lamps provided. It felt like the road was pulling me deeper into the dark, pushing me further from the familiar. And then I saw it. A shadow moved across the road, just ahead of me, skittering across the path like something had dashed out from the woods. I slammed my foot on the brake, the car skidding a little. My heart raced as I tried to peer through the windshield, trying to make out what had moved in the dark. But there was nothing. For a moment, everything was still, too still. I sat there, my hands clenched on the steering wheel, trying to breathe. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. Probably a raccoon or something. But as I inched forward again, I noticed something that made the blood in my veins freeze. The street signs. The ones I had seen countless times before, they were different. It wasn't much at first, just a subtle change. The font on the signs was slightly off, as though they were printed in a different style. But there was something else. The names of the streets, the ones that had always been familiar, had changed. I leaned forward, squinting at the nearest sign. It was now marked with a name I didn't recognize. A name that didn't exist in my city. I blinked, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Was this some kind of prank? Maybe a new development I wasn't aware of? But it didn't feel like that. The air around me felt colder, the night darker. I glanced in the rearview mirror, only to see nothing but black. The road behind me, where I had just come from, was gone. The path, the road, had already closed off. There was no going back. Panic started to settle in. My thoughts raced. What had I gotten myself into? I had driven past this way every evening, and I knew my city, knew it well. But this was something entirely different. I could hear the faint hum of something in the distance, a sound I couldn't quite place. It was soft at first, but it seemed to grow louder, closer, like the whirring of machines or the low drone of an engine. And then, the air felt thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I turned down another street, trying to shake off the growing anxiety, hoping to find something familiar again. But the more I drove, the more I realized that nothing was right. The houses, though they looked similar, were just a little off. The way the lights flickered in the windows. The way the shadows cast on the pavement. They weren't quite real. And the people. I saw them, walking down the street, figures in the distance, moving slowly, too slowly. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could feel their eyes on me, following me. I turned away, the sense of unease crawling up my spine. It wasn't just the streets or the signs. It was the whole place. This wasn't my city. It couldn't be. It was a mirror image, a reflection of everything I knew, but warped, twisted, like something had been changed, altered, and I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't fully understand. I had to get out of here. But how? Where was the exit? What had happened to the road I knew so well? I drove faster, the hum in the air growing louder, more insistent. The people, those strange, faceless people, seemed to be getting closer. Every corner I turned, I found myself back in the same place, the same street, the same unsettling shadows. And I realized the truth too late. There was no way out. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every turn I made. I couldn't shake the sense of wrongness in the air. I had driven through this city countless times, but now every street felt like a maze, each corner twisting back into itself. The trees, the houses, the roads, they were all so familiar, yet just enough off to unsettle me. As if I were in a world that was almost the same as mine, but not quite. The streetlights flickered, casting long, flickering shadows, making the city seem like it was alive, breathing with me. I tried to focus on the road, but my eyes kept drifting to the edges, to the strange distortions in the space around me. The trees seemed to shift unnaturally in the wind, their limbs twisting and contorting like they were reaching for me. I took another turn, desperate to find something, anything, that might tell me where I was. The buildings around me seemed older than I remembered, their edges sharp and angular, their windows too dark to reflect any light. A part of me wanted to believe it was just my nerves, that I was tired, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. I slowed down when I saw the familiar corner of Main Street, the place I had passed 1,000 times before. The diner with the neon sign, the gas station across the street, and the old brick building where I used to work. It should have felt like home. But it didn't. Not anymore. The sign outside the diner was cracked, the neon flickering in a way I had never seen. It didn't say open like it always did. It simply read, gone. A shiver ran through me. I didn't know why, but I had to get out of the car. I parked on the side of the street and stepped out, the cold night air biting into my skin. The street was eerily silent. No cars. No people. Not a single sound except for the hum of the dim streetlights above. I approached the diner cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the familiar bell above it ringing loudly. But inside, it wasn't right. The booths were empty, but the tables were set as though they were waiting for customers. The menus sat on the counter, untouched, as if frozen in time. But it wasn't the emptiness that bothered me, it was the way the air felt. Thick. Stale. Like something had happened here and time had simply stopped. I walked deeper into the diner, my heart pounding in my chest. There was a light on in the back room, faint and dim. Curiosity got the better of me, and I moved toward it, the floor creaking beneath my feet. When I reached the doorway, I froze. There, sitting at the counter, was a man. He was wearing a worn leather jacket, his back to me, his hands resting on the counter. I couldn't see his face, but I knew he wasn't real. There was something off about him, like his presence was too solid, too present for a place that felt so abandoned. I felt his eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. He didn't turn around, but I could hear him speak in a low, gravelly voice. Looking for something? I didn't answer. I couldn't. My breath caught in my throat, and I slowly backed away, the floor groaning under my feet. I turned and ran out of the diner, my heart pounding louder than ever. I rushed back to the car, slamming the door shut behind me. I needed to get away. I needed to find something familiar. But no matter which direction I drove, nothing was right. The city had changed again. It was like a distorted reflection, a parallel world where nothing was where it should be. The houses were too close together, the windows too dark. The sky above seemed to soar with clouds, like a storm was on the horizon, but there was no rain, no wind, just a suffocating pressure in the air. And then, I saw it. In the distance, I saw a figure. A woman, standing still in the middle of the street, her back to me. She was dressed in a long coat, her hair falling in waves down her back. She didn't move. I slowed down, my eyes fixed on her. I wasn't sure why, but something about her seemed familiar. I knew her, or at least, I thought I did. But how? I had never seen her before in my life. I stopped the car, my breath caught in my throat. The woman remained motionless, her figure standing against the backdrop of the dark sky. I wanted to scream, to honk the horn, to drive away. But I couldn't move. And then she turned, slowly, deliberately. Her eyes. They were empty. Hollow. No pupils. No expression. Just nothing. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and sped away, my heart racing. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But the woman was still there. Her presence lingered even as I drove, her gaze burned into my skin. The road stretched ahead of me, twisting and turning, but I couldn't find my way out. This place, this city, wasn't mine. It never had been. I was stuck in a version of the world that didn't make sense, a place that was falling apart piece by piece. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't escape. And as I drove, I could feel it. The road was watching me. I don't know how long I had been driving, but it felt like hours, maybe even days. The world around me had blurred into a strange, hazy dream. Every street, every house, every turn I took seemed to bring me back to the same place. It was like I was trapped in a loop, and no matter how far I went, there was no escape. The hum in the air was louder now. The sound was almost physical, vibrating beneath my skin, like something was trying to force its way into my mind. The streetlights flickered again, casting erratic shadows that danced across the road, making the buildings seem to shift and breathe. Every time I blinked, the world seemed to change ever so slightly, like the edges were blurring, slipping into something else. I looked to the side of the road and saw a familiar sight, the gas station. I had passed this place countless times, but now it felt wrong. The sign was crooked, the lights flickering like the rest of the city, and the station itself was empty. No cars, no workers, nothing. Just the dull hum of the fluorescent lights above. I stopped the car and sat there for a moment, my hand frozen on the wheel. I knew I had to keep moving, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me here, to this place that felt both familiar and alien. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. I walked toward the entrance of the gas station, my footsteps muffled by the thick silence. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the shelves were stocked, but everything was wrong. The cans of soda were all different brands, the newspapers were from a different year, and the familiar candy bars I used to grab on a whim were nowhere to be found. A man stood behind the counter, but he didn't look like any clerk I had seen before. His face was pale, his eyes wide open as though he hadn't blinked in years. He was staring at me, unblinking. His mouth was slightly open, but no words came out. He didn't move. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the growing dread in my chest. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking. "Can you tell me where I am?" He didn't respond. I took a step forward, closer to the counter, but the man didn't acknowledge me. It was as though I wasn't even there. His eyes were fixed on something beyond me, lost in whatever world he was trapped in. I looked around, hoping to find something that would explain what was happening. But the longer I stayed in that place, the more wrong it felt. The air in the gas station was thick, stifling, like it was filled with the remnants of some unseen force. And then I heard it. A soft rustling sound. The faintest scrape of a footstep against the floor. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. But there was nothing. I turned back to the man at the counter, but he was still staring ahead, his eyes locked in place, as if he were waiting for something or someone. I felt a sharp pain in my chest. The dread was growing. I needed to leave. But as I turned to the door, I caught a glimpse of something that stopped me in my tracks. In the window, I saw a reflection. But it wasn't mine. It was a woman, standing just behind me, her face obscured by the reflection of the shelves. She was tall, dressed in a long coat, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders. But it wasn't her presence that made my blood run cold, it was her eyes. Those empty, hollow eyes. The same eyes I had seen earlier. The ones that followed me. I spun around, but she wasn't there. There was no one behind me. Just the man at the counter, staring into nothing. I ran out of the gas station, my heart pounding. I could feel the city pressing in on me, its twisted streets closing in. I needed to get away. I needed to find something real, something solid. I got back into the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The road stretched out before me, but I couldn't tell which way was home anymore. The signs, the landmarks, nothing made sense. I sped down the street, my mind racing. And that's when I saw it again. The woman. She was standing in the middle of the road, just ahead of me, her back to me once more. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The car lurched to a stop, and for a moment, everything was silent. She turned slowly, her head tilting to the side as if examining me, studying me. I could feel her eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. The air around her was heavy, oppressive. "Why are you following me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. She didn't answer. She just stood there, motionless, her figure blending with the shadows. And then, without warning, she started to walk toward me. I hit the gas, speeding away from her, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The engine roared beneath me, but I wasn't sure if I was escaping or running straight into something worse. Every turn I made, I could feel her presence behind me. I could sense her, following me, no matter where I went. And the hum in the air was louder now, pulsing like a heartbeat. The road didn't end. It didn't stop. I drove and drove, but no matter how many times I turned, how many streets I passed, the city was always the same. The same twisted reflection of what I knew. I had to face the truth. This place, this world, I wasn't supposed to be here. And whatever was watching me wasn't going to let me leave. I couldn't tell how much time had passed since I had left the gas station, nor could I shake the suffocating feeling that time itself was slipping through my fingers. Every street I passed, every building I saw, felt more distorted, more distant, as though I were being pulled further away from the world I had known. The road stretched out endlessly before me, yet it led nowhere. I drove in circles, each turn the same as the last. The city was trapped in some warped version of itself, a place I couldn't seem to escape. I didn't know how I was still awake, how I hadn't completely lost my mind yet, but I was beginning to feel like I was no longer in control. Something else was. I glanced to my right, out of the corner of my eye. There, in the distance, I saw a familiar building, the old library, the one I used to visit all the time. It was supposed to be a comforting sight, but as I neared, I saw that the doors were wide open. The dark interior seemed to beckon me, as though it were waiting for me to enter. I didn't want to go inside. I had already seen too many things that didn't make sense, things that twisted and bent reality. But there was something about the library, some force pulling me toward it. I slowed the car and pulled into the parking lot, my tires scraping against the asphalt. The hum of the engine died, leaving only the eerie silence of the night. I took a deep breath, my heart racing. The air smelled stale, almost like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the open doors. Then, as if I had no choice, I stepped out of the car. The library was darker than I remembered. The tall windows, usually letting in the soft light of day, were now pitch black, the shadows creeping inside. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the sound of creaking hinges filling the silence. It felt as though I was stepping into a place long abandoned, yet something about it was alive, watching, waiting. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit with a wave of cold air. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and the floorboards beneath my feet creaked with each step I took. The shelves were lined with books, thousands of them, untouched, unmoved. But the air felt heavy with something unseen. I took a step forward, the silence pressing on me from all sides. There was a low hum in the background, barely audible, but it was there, vibrating through the walls. The faintest scrape of something, like a nail against wood. My heart skipped a beat. I turned the corner into the reading room, and that's when I saw it. A figure, sitting at one of the tables, hunched over a book. It looked like a man, dressed in a dark suit, his face obscured by the shadow cast by the dim lights above. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just sat there, reading, or at least pretending to. I froze. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave, but my feet wouldn't move. Something about the figure in the shadows held me in place, rooted to the floor. I couldn't tell if it was the same man from the gas station or if he was someone else entirely. But before I could gather my thoughts, the man slowly lifted his head. I couldn't see his face. Not fully. But what I did see made my blood run cold. His eyes, his hollow, dark eyes, were staring directly at me, unblinking, unfeeling. The same eyes. The same emptiness. Looking for something? His voice was a low rasp, barely audible above the hum of the library. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. It felt like my body was frozen, like I had somehow stepped out of time. His gaze held me captive, pulling me deeper into the shadow of the room. "Why are you here?" I finally managed to croak, my voice shaking with fear. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. His movements were unnatural, slow, deliberate, like he was dragging himself through time. I stepped back, but my legs wouldn't carry me. I was stuck, trapped in the cold, oppressive air of the library. The shadows around me deepened, stretching longer, more grotesque. The man took a step forward, and then another, his figure looming over me. I could feel the pressure of his presence, suffocating. "You don't belong here," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. The walls of the library seemed to close in on me, the shelves bending toward me like they were reaching out, wanting to trap me. "No!" I gasped, taking a step back, my body finally responding to the terror flooding my veins. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the wooden floor. The sound of my own breathing was deafening in the thick silence. I could feel his presence behind me, like he was chasing me, always just out of reach. The library seemed to twist around me, the path ahead disappearing as quickly as I could take a step forward. The doors were too far. I couldn't make it. A loud crash echoed through the room. Bookshelves toppled, their contents scattering across the floor like rain. And then, the low growl. It wasn't human. I stumbled forward, my mind racing, but everything around me was a blur. The space was warping, shifting, becoming something else, something darker. I felt a tug, a pull, as though the ground beneath me was no longer stable. The walls around me stretched and bent, the ceiling collapsing inward. I finally reached the doors, throwing them open and stumbling outside, gasping for breath. But the city had changed again. The road was no longer familiar. The buildings were where they had been before. The streets twisted like a living thing, and the sky above was dark with swirling clouds, as though the very atmosphere was choking. The hum was louder now. I could feel it in my bones. And then I realized something else. I wasn't alone anymore. The cold air outside felt different, colder, more oppressive, as if it was suffocating everything around me. I staggered through the twisted streets, my mind reeling. Every step felt like I was walking on fragile glass, afraid that if I moved too quickly, it would all shatter. The world around me seemed to be bending on itself, distorting with each passing second. It was like the ground was unsteady beneath me, like reality itself was unraveling. I turned around, half expecting to see the figure from the library following me, but there was no one. The streets were empty, eerily silent. There were no sounds of traffic, no distant chatter, no signs of life at all. The silence was deafening, pressing on me from all sides. But then, the hum came again, louder this time. It vibrated through the ground, through my bones, making my teeth ache. I looked up, and the sky wasn't right. It was swirling, twisting, dark clouds merging together like a storm was brewing. But it wasn't natural. It didn't feel like a storm. It felt like the sky itself was alive, shifting, reacting to something unseen. I stumbled forward, my heart pounding. My feet carried me without thinking, drawn towards something. I didn't know what. Some part of me knew that whatever I was running from, whatever was chasing me, was still out there. It was everywhere, in the air, in the ground, in the shadows. Watching. And that's when I saw it again. The woman. She stood at the end of the street, her back turned to me, just like before. But this time, I could see her more clearly. Her coat billowed in the windless air, her hair whipping around her face, though there was no breeze. I couldn't see her eyes, but I could feel them on me, through me. She wasn't real. She couldn't be. But she was there, standing at the edge of my world, like a specter waiting to drag me into whatever nightmare I had fallen into. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. She didn't move. She didn't turn to face me. but I could feel the pull, like gravity itself was shifting toward her, drawing me closer. I tried to turn away, tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if they were stuck in cement. The ground underfoot began to tremble, just slightly, but enough to unsettle me. The hum grew louder, the sound of it vibrating in my skull, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I looked back at her. Her head turned, slowly, impossibly slow, until her face was revealed. Those hollow, empty eyes locked onto mine. She smiled, but there was nothing more human in it. It was a smile that chilled me to my core, a smile that told me I was no longer in control. "You've seen it now," she whispered. "You've crossed over." I tried to speak, to scream, but the words caught in my throat. There was nothing left but the oppressive silence of the city and her voice echoing in my mind. "You're one of us now." The ground trembled again, stronger this time, and I staggered back, my vision blurring. The buildings around me began to melt, their shapes shifting and distorting like they were made of liquid. The air thickened, pressing in from all sides, as though the city itself was collapsing, folding inward. I looked at the woman once more, and for the first time, I understood. This wasn't just a place. It wasn't a city. It was a prison. A place between worlds. Between what's real and what isn't. A place where the rules of time and space didn't apply. And I had wandered in by mistake or maybe on purpose. But now, there was no way out. The woman's smile widened, and in that moment, I understood that I was not just trapped in the city. I was trapped in myself. The sky above began to crack, breaking into jagged shards of light, and I felt my body start to dissolve, feeding into the darkness around me. The hum became deafening, a scream that rattled my bones, and then everything went quiet. It was the silence of a world that had ceased to exist. Have you ever felt like time was slipping through your fingers? Like everything around you, every moment you're living, is just a moment before something much worse happens? What if, one day, the future reached out to you? What if it tried to warn you? And what if you couldn't ignore it? My name is Eleanor, and I wasn't the type of person to believe in strange occurrences, not until that day. It was a Thursday, a quiet afternoon with nothing unusual to report. I had just gotten home from work, tired from the day's monotony. The old house I had moved into felt eerily still, as if it had been waiting for something. I hadn't even bothered to unpack everything yet, but boxes still scattered around the living room, a reminder of a life I was trying to leave behind. It was the kind of place that gave off an unsettling feeling, but I told myself that was just the settling of an old home. The phone rang. It was strange because I didn't remember plugging in the old rotary phone that had been sitting on the kitchen counter since I moved in. I hadn't used it. It hadn't worked in years. But there it was, ringing, the sharp, echoing sound breaking the quiet of the room. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the phone. I could hear the clinking of the dialer as the sound of each ring filled the space. It was almost as if the house itself was mocking me, pushing me towards something I wasn't ready for. My hand moved on its own. I reached for the receiver, my fingers trembling as I lifted it to my ear. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, distant, like I wasn't even in my own body. There was a long silence on the other end, followed by a sharp, shuddering breath. It sounded familiar, almost like my own. "Eleanor?" The voice on the other end was soft but urgent. The same voice. My voice. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I swallowed, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But the voice on the other end, my voice, continued speaking, and the words chilled me to the bone. You have to listen to me. You're in danger. You're about to make a mistake. Something terrible is going to happen if you don't stop what you're doing right now. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to slam the receiver back into place and forget all about it, but my hand wouldn't move. My mind raced as I tried to process the words. The voice, my voice, spoke again, this time more urgently. You don't have much time. The future, no, your future is already changing. The things you think are under control are slipping away. You have to be careful. You're not alone in this. There are forces. The line suddenly went dead. I stood there, the receiver still pressed to my ear, my heart hammering in my chest. The quiet of the house rushed back to fill the space, but it was different now. The silence felt wrong. I pulled the phone away and looked at it, as if it might explain itself, but there was nothing. No dial tone, no voice. Just the stillness. I slowly set the receiver back down, but my mind was racing. Was it a prank? But how would anyone know my name, my voice? Could someone have been in my house? The house I hadn't even had the time to properly settle into. But even as I tried to convince myself it had to be some sort of mistake, a part of me couldn't shake the fear that had crept into my chest. It wasn't just a voice. It was the warning. The sense of urgency in that tone, as if the world around me was on the edge of something I wasn't prepared for. I tried to dismiss it, shaking my head, but then I remembered something else. A feeling I had earlier in the day. A strange sensation of being watched, of being followed. It was so subtle I had convinced myself it was nothing more than paranoia, but now it lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. And then, the clock on the wall struck midnight. I hadn't even noticed the time passing. The ticking of the clock was louder now, as if time itself was echoing through the room. The silence I'd once felt comfortable and now felt suffocating. My thoughts kept returning to that voice, to the warning. I was still trying to make sense of it all when the phone rang again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I picked it up immediately, but before I could say anything, I heard the voice again, more frantic than before. Eleanor, listen to me. It's happening. I told you, you have to stop it before it's too late. The future is changing, and if you don't act now, it will be too late for everything. I could feel the cold creeping into my veins. It was like something was shifting in the air, something dark and unfathomable. The voice on the other end was trembling now, like it was desperate for me to understand. You're not going to survive this if you don't listen. If you don't change what you're doing, you won't be able to save yourself. You won't have another chance. Who is this? What do you want? I managed to choke out, my voice cracking as the terror gripped me tighter. You know who I am, the voice said, and in that moment, I realized it was me. It was myself on the other end. I wasn't speaking to some stranger. I wasn't hearing a distant echo. I was hearing the future calling me, warning me of something I hadn't even begun to understand. And then, just like before, the line went dead. I was left in the darkness, alone, with only the sound of my own breathing filling the room. My mind raced as I tried to process the impossible. How could I be talking to myself from the future? What was happening? What was coming for me? I glanced nervously at the clock again. It had stopped. The world outside seemed quieter now, as if everything had frozen in place. But something in the air felt different, as if time itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then I heard it. The faintest sound, like footsteps approaching from far away. It was too late to turn back. The future was already here. I couldn't stop the shiver that crawled down my spine. The footsteps, were they real? Were they just my imagination, playing tricks on me in the silence of the night? I strained to listen, but there was nothing. The house felt impossibly still again, but I knew better now. The air was heavier, denser, like something was pressing down from above. The phone call echoed in my head. It's happening. You have to stop it. I couldn't shake the feeling that my voice, had been telling me something I hadn't understood yet, something crucial that I couldn't quite grasp. I paced across the room, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that I wasn't alone, that the shadows in the corners of the room were watching, waiting. I turned on all the lights in the house, but they didn't provide the comfort they once had. The flickering bulbs cast strange shadows, like hands reaching from the walls, trying to pull me into something I couldn't comprehend. The silence felt oppressive. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the knowledge that something was wrong, something wasn't right. That sense of wrongness gnawed at me. Then, the phone rang again. I froze. My pulse quickened, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to pretend none of this was happening, but I knew I couldn't. This time, I didn't wait. I snatched the receiver, my hands clammy, and put it to my ear. But no one spoke. I waited, my breath shallow, straining to hear something. Anything. The line crackled, and I thought for a moment it was just interference. But then I heard it, the faintest sound, like a voice on the other end, too faint to make out. Eleanor. I gasped. My own name, whispered in that voice that sounded so familiar, yet so distant. My hand shook as I held the receiver, my mind racing. Who is this? I whispered, my throat tight with fear. What do you want from me? The silence stretched on, suffocating, before the voice responded again, this time clearer, more forceful. You already know. You have to remember. It's not over. It hasn't happened yet, but it will. You have to change what you did. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the room seemed to darken, the air thickening around me. I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. What did I have to change? What had I done? I felt like I was losing myself, like the ground was slipping beneath my feet, and I was about to fall into a chasm of endless uncertainty. The voice, though, it wasn't finished. It was urgent, frantic now. It's going to be your fault, Eleanor. You can stop it, but only if you. The line went dead again. No warning. No goodbye. Just the same terrifying silence that had enveloped me before. I pulled the receiver away, my head spinning, and I sank to the floor, my knees weak. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my heart pounding in my ears. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. And yet, I knew this wasn't a nightmare. This was real. I could feel it. I could feel the presence of something out there, something I couldn't see, but that was closing in on me like a storm gathering on the horizon. I forced myself to stand, shaking with fear. I had to get out of the house. I had to move. Someone, was coming for me. The voice had warned me, and I had to listen. I had to act. But where could I go? I couldn't run from the future. I couldn't outrun whatever was coming. No matter how far I went, how fast, the phone call would still be there, echoing in my mind. It had already happened. I had already made the choice, whatever it was. The voice had said it had happened, but it hadn't yet. I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't fully comprehend, and I had no idea how deep the fall would be. The front door was locked. I had no intention of going out that way, though. I felt like I couldn't escape through the door. The walls, the air, everything felt wrong. I could feel the house closing in on me, as though the very space was alive, breathing with me, suffocating me. I had no idea what to do. But then I remembered something. A detail I had overlooked, something insignificant just moments ago, but now it felt like the key to everything. The old clock in the living room. The one that had stopped when the second phone call ended. It had been ticking for years, like it had been frozen in time. But now, it was still, its hand stuck at exactly midnight. Could the clock be connected? Was it a sign? Was my time, running out? I walked toward the clock, drawn to it by some invisible force. My fingers brushed the surface of the glass as I stared at the unmoving hands. There was no way of knowing how long they'd been stuck in place, but something about it unsettled me. I tried to shake off the feeling, but the more I stared, the more I felt the air grow colder, the shadows lengthening around me. The phone rang again. I didn't pick it up this time. Instead, I stood frozen, staring at the clock. And then I saw it. In the reflection of the clock's glass, just behind me, a shadow moved. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot. The whisper in the back of my mind had grown louder, the voice urging me to act, to move, to do something. But I couldn't make myself move. The shadow grew closer. I wasn't alone anymore. The shadow behind me grew darker, stretching like a living thing, slowly inching closer. I could feel its presence now, an unnatural weight pressing on my back. It wasn't just a trick of the light, or my mind playing games. It was there. I could sense it, feel it in the hairs on my neck, the cold air that seemed to fill the room, wrapping itself around me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, choked with fear. The voice on the phone echoed in my mind again, louder now, as though it were coming from right behind me. It's already begun, Eleanor. You can't stop it now. It's too late. I turned my head, barely, just enough to see what was in the reflection. But when I did, my heart stopped. There was no one there. The room was empty, just as it had been moments before. The space was still, eerily still. But the reflection in the clock, it wasn't still. The figure in the glass was standing right behind me. It was a woman. But it wasn't me, not exactly. Her features were distorted, like a warped version of my own reflection, hollow eyes, an unnatural tilt to her head, a twisted smile stretching across her face. It was as if she was trying to mirror me, but something was terribly wrong. She was wrong. I stumbled backward, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, its smile widening as I froze in terror. My breath came in shallow gasps. I had to get away from the clock, from the thing in the reflection. But I couldn't. The phone rang again. I wanted to ignore it, to forget about the voice, the warning, the shadow that seemed to have come to life. But the sound of that ringing was unbearable, like a drumbeat, relentless and maddening. My hand reached out on its own, trembling as I grabbed the receiver. Eleanor. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was my own voice, but it was cold, distant, like a ghost trying to reach through time itself. You have to listen to me. You're not alone. It's not just the house, it's you. You're becoming her. I froze. The room around me seemed to tilt, and my vision blurred for a moment. The voice was speaking to me, but it wasn't just warning me anymore. It was accusing me, telling me that the woman in the reflection was not some hallucination, not some trick of the mind. She was me. A version of me, twisted and broken. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone away, but I couldn't. The grip on the receiver was tight, unyielding. The shadow behind me in the clock's reflection shifted again, stepping closer, its face still distorted, but now it was smiling, not in a reassuring way, but in a cruel, mocking manner, as if it knew something I didn't. The voice on the phone continued. You don't understand, Eleanor. You've already made the wrong choice. She's coming for you. There's nothing you can do to stop it. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to blink. I wouldn't let myself look away from the reflection. Not yet. I needed to understand. I needed to know what was happening. Who? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Who's coming for me? The phone went silent. Then, in the reflection, the twisted version of me raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, and pressed it against the glass. The glass seemed to ripple beneath her touch, distorting like water. A sudden chill filled the room, and I shivered uncontrollably. The voice from the phone returned, but now it was urgent, desperate. Eleanor, please. You can't let her out. You're her. You have to stop it. The voice broke off, replaced by a static screech. The figure in the reflection moved, too fast, too fluid. It was no longer a reflection. It was stepping out from the glass. I stumbled backward, heart pounding. The reflection, she was no longer trapped in the clock. She was stepping forward, her form becoming solid, her face growing clearer. I could see the hollow eyes now, the twisted smile that stretched impossibly wide. She wasn't just a version of me. She was me, but not me. I turned to run, but the room seemed to stretch. The walls closed in, the door was farther away than it should have been, and the air grew heavier, thicker with each breath. The phone line crackled again, but I couldn't make sense of the words anymore. They were lost beneath the oppressive weight of the room, the suffocating presence of the thing that was now standing right behind me. I felt her hand on my shoulder. I turned around, but there was no one there. The room was empty again, but I could still feel her. Her presence, hovering just behind me. I had to get out. I had to leave. But every way I turned, every escape I tried, the house twisted and reshaped itself, trapping me in the same space over and over again. The walls seemed to breathe, pulse with life. The phone line hummed with static, but this time I heard something else too, something more terrifying. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, moving closer. I wasn't alone. The footsteps grew louder, each one echoing in the empty space, but the noise didn't come from anywhere I could see. They were getting closer. Closer. I pressed myself against the wall, heart racing in my chest as I strained to hear the direction they were coming from. They weren't on the floor above me. They weren't even in the room with me. But the sound was undeniably real, like someone walking just behind the walls, just beyond the reach of my sight. I couldn't breathe. My mind was frantically searching for an explanation, anything that would make sense of what was happening. But I couldn't make sense of it. Nothing about this made sense. How was I hearing footsteps, voices, the flickering static of the phone, but no one was physically here? How was I trapped inside my own house, with a shadow that wasn't mine closing in on me? I had to get out. I had to leave. I turned around, my body trembling as I scanned the room, my eyes darting from the walls to the door and back. The door was still there, but the hallway outside was a blur, like it was shifting, warping with every glance. It didn't look like it had before. There were no longer familiar corners, no welcoming light at the end. The hallway stretched on, turning into a dark abyss, an endless tunnel that seemed to lead nowhere. Something was wrong. The walls seemed to be closing on me again, the air thick with a weight I couldn't escape. I stumbled forward, my feet dragging, trying to reach the door, but it felt farther away, as if the space itself was stretching, mocking me. The footsteps were closer now, so close I could feel them vibrating through the floor, beneath my feet. The sound was deafening, pounding like a heartbeat. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers brushing against the cold brass, but as I tried to turn it, the knob wouldn't move. It was stuck. Locked. I jerked the door with all my strength, but it didn't budge. The room felt smaller, tighter, and the shadows seemed to gather at the edges of the walls, creeping closer, waiting. And then, I heard it again, that voice. "Stop running, Eleanor." The voice was unmistakable. It was my own, but it wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It wasn't coming from anywhere in the room. It was just there, in the air, surrounding me. It was inside me. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, my hands covering my ears, trying to block it out. But it was futile. The voice wouldn't leave. "You can't escape, Eleanor. You can't outrun it." I pressed my back against the door, my eyes wide as I scanned the room once more. Was she here? The woman from the reflection? I didn't know. The walls were so thick with tension, so suffocating, I couldn't tell where the room ended and where I began. It felt like I was losing myself, slipping between two worlds, one that was real and one that wasn't. I stood up, the room spinning as I tried to focus. The footsteps were right behind me now. I could feel them in my bones. They were getting closer, louder, and then silence. Just like that. Complete silence. I gasped for air, my chest rising and falling in sharp, panic breaths. I dared a glance over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. The air, which had felt thick and heavy, had suddenly cleared. For a brief moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, I was going insane. Maybe all of this was in my head. But then, I heard it. A knock. The sound was soft at first, but it grew louder with each passing second, becoming more insistent. The knock was coming from the door. The door that I knew was locked. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then the voice came again, not from the phone this time, but directly in front of me. It was her voice. The twisted version of me. "You're still here," it whispered. "You can't leave." I looked at the door again, my mind reeling, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. I reached out, trembling, my hand brushing the surface of the door. It was cold, unnaturally cold. But there was no handle to turn, no way to escape. I looked down, and for the first time, I saw it. The door wasn't a door at all. It was just an illusion, a thin layer of paint that masked the wall. There was no door frame, no way out. My breath caught in my throat. I felt my knees give way as I collapsed to the floor, my hands reaching out to touch the empty space where the door should have been. It wasn't real. None of it was real. The knock came again, louder this time, harder. I could feel it in my chest, in my bones. A force that was coming from the other side of the door, a force that wanted to break through, wanted to claim me. The room started to spin again, faster now, the walls warping, shifting as if they were breathing. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. But where could I go? And then I heard the voice once more, clear and unmistakable. It was right in front of me, the words cutting through the chaos. You're already too late. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. You're already too late. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a truth I couldn't escape. My heart raced as I stared at the empty space where the door should have been, unable to tear my eyes away, even though every instinct screamed for me to run. I wanted to scream, to beg for help, to do something, anything, but all I could do was sit there, paralyzed by the undeniable sense of dread that filled the room. My hands shook, my chest tight with panic, as the voice echoed in my mind, looping like a curse that I couldn't break. And then the knocking came again. It was louder now, harder. The walls trembled with it, vibrating through the floor, the ceiling, the very air around me. The sound was unbearable, like a drumbeat that struck directly into the core of my being, shaking my bones. I couldn't stay here. But the room, the walls, the door, everything had become one, closing in on me, twisting, turning, making it impossible to tell what was real and what wasn't. There was no escape. No way out. I got to my feet, my legs weak beneath me, and I pressed my hands against the walls. The texture was wrong, not the smoothness of the plaster I was used to. It felt alive. Like the walls were breathing, pulsing in time with my frantic heartbeats. I gasped, stumbling back, but there was no corner to retreat to. The space felt endless, like I was trapped inside a living nightmare. Then, I felt it. A presence behind me, creeping slowly, deliberately, until it was right there. I didn't need to turn around. I could feel it in every fiber of my being. She was here. The woman. The reflection. The twisted version of me. I could hear her breathing, deep and ragged, just inches away. She wasn't speaking now. She didn't need to. I could feel her hatred, her emptiness pressing down on me. It was suffocating. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. My mind was racing, trying to find a way out, a way to break free. But it was hopeless. There was nothing. No escape. No salvation. And then, slowly, I turned. I was face to face with her. With me. Her face was a mirror of my own, but twisted, contorted in a way I couldn't understand. Her eyes were dark, hollow, empty, like they had seen the end of everything. Her smile, stretched too wide, too thin, was the final sign of her twisted nature. She wasn't me. She was what I could become. What I was becoming. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was too tight, my chest too heavy. I reached out for her, but my hand trembled, unsure of what to do. It felt like I was reaching for something that shouldn't exist, something that was both part of me and completely separate. You can't outrun me, Eleanor, she whispered, her voice a sickening echo of my own. I'm not a reflection. I'm what you were always meant to become. The world around me seemed to warp, everything spinning faster and faster. I couldn't keep up. The walls stretched, then collapsed, the floor beneath me buckling. Everything was a blur, a nightmare that no amount of running could escape. The phone rang once more. Its shrill sound cut through the chaos, dragging my attention away from the figure in front of me. I stared at the receiver, wondering if it would be my own voice again, urging me to leave, to survive. But I knew it wouldn't matter. The phone wasn't the problem anymore. I was the problem. I had become the reflection. I had become her. The walls began to close in once more, the air thick with a presence that was too much to bear. The footsteps, the voice, the knocking, it was all connected. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape myself. And then there was only silence. Have you ever felt like you were being watched, but when you turned around, there was no one there? That was how it started, just a strange feeling, an unsettling shiver crawling up my spine whenever I sat by the window in my apartment. It wasn't something I noticed immediately, but gradually, like a slow creeping shadow, the feeling became harder to ignore. I live on the 10th floor of an old building, one of those high-rise apartments that overlook the city's busy streets. At night, when everything goes quiet, I like to sit in the armchair near the window, a cup of coffee in hand, and watch the city lights flicker in the distance. But it was during one of these nights that I first saw it. I hadn't noticed it at first. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A figure, just outside the window, shifting in the shadows of the building across from mine. It was strange. The lights in that building were always dim, and no one had ever been on that floor at night, at least, not that I could remember. I brushed it off, assuming it was a trick of the light or my tired eyes playing games with me. But the next night, it happened again. The shadow moved, just beyond the edge of my view. I couldn't make out any details, but it was clear someone, or something, was there, just outside my window, pacing back and forth. It was only a small movement at first, almost imperceptible, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but something about it felt wrong. As the days went by, it continued. Every night, just after I sat down by the window, the shadow appeared. Always on the same side of the building, always moving slowly, deliberately, as if it were aware of my presence. I began to grow paranoid, waiting for it to appear, always just out of reach of my sight, never fully clear. My heart would race, and I would pull away from the window, but it would always be there, lurking in the corner of my vision. The fear was subtle at first, just a feeling, a sense of unease. But then the noise started. Quiet at first, just the faintest sound, like the soft scrape of something moving across the floor. It was barely audible, but it was there. Every night, it grew louder. The sound was always at the same time, the exact moment I settled into my chair, the moment I was about to convince myself that I was imagining it. The moment when I would look out the window and see the shadow, clearer this time, just a little closer. I couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, after a week of these unsettling occurrences, I decided to do something about it. I grabbed my phone, determined to capture whatever was happening, to prove to myself that I wasn't going insane. The phone's camera had always been reliable, and I thought that if I could get a clear shot of the shadow, I would finally have an answer. Something tangible, something real. I aimed the camera out the window, my finger hovering above the screen, waiting for the shadow to appear again. My heart pounded in my chest as I focused the lens, trying to steady my trembling hand. The screen was just as it always was, the dim glow of the building across the way, the faint outline of the shadow. And then it happened. The moment I pressed the button, the shadow seemed to shift. It stopped, as if it had felt the camera's gaze, as if it had noticed me watching. The phone screen flickered. I stared at it in confusion. The image began to distort, the picture jumping and jerking, as if something was interfering with the signal. I tapped the screen, but the camera refused to focus. The shadow on the other side of the building grew darker, more defined. It seemed to stretch across the glass, inching closer to my own reflection. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My fingers tightened around the phone, but as I looked up, just for a moment, to see the shadow clearly, the camera went black. The screen went completely dark. I stared at it, pressing every button, hoping it was just a glitch. But nothing happened. The phone was dead. It didn't make sense. The phone hadn't been dropped or damaged. It had been working perfectly fine just moments before. But now it was nothing more than a useless piece of plastic and glass in my hand. I put the phone down and turned back to the window, my heart racing. The shadow was still there. But now, it wasn't moving. It was watching me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening. But I knew one thing for sure, this wasn't normal. And whatever it wasn't just outside my window. It had followed me inside. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The silence in my apartment was suffocating, like the world outside had stopped spinning. My mind raced as I stared at the black screen of my phone. I kept tapping it, willing it to turn on, to show me some sign that I wasn't losing my mind. But the more I tried, the more it seemed to slip further away from me. The shadow outside the window didn't move. It didn't have to. Its presence was enough to fill the entire room, a weight pressing down on me. It was as though the world outside was holding its breath, waiting for something. I was no longer just a spectator to this strange occurrence. I was a part of it now. I backed away from the window, trying to gather my thoughts. The apartment felt too small, too confined. I could hear my breath, shallow and rapid, and my pulse pounding in my ears. My eyes darted around, trying to reassure myself that everything else was normal. The furniture was in place, the lamp still cast its soft glow against the walls, and the distant hum of the city was just as it always had been. But it wasn't the same. There was something different, something wrong. The shadow outside wasn't just a trick of the light or my imagination. It was real. And it knew I was here. The hours stretched on, and I couldn't look away from the window. I was trapped in the stillness, caught between my own fear and the undeniable pull of the shadow. The night felt endless, like it would never end. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, paralyzed, but eventually exhaustion overtook me. I had to sleep. I couldn't keep this up. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. My eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound, any sign of movement. My thoughts began to spiral, drowning in the silence that seemed to grow louder the longer I stayed awake. And then it came. A soft tap. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. It was on the window. I bolted upright, my heart skipping a beat. My body was frozen in place. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The tap came again, followed by another. Then a third, quicker, more urgent. Someone, or something, was tapping on the glass. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to turn my head, unable to move. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to get away from the window, but my body wouldn't obey. The taps grew louder, faster. They were no longer random but rhythmic, deliberate. They were calling to me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. My hand shot out, and I grabbed the blanket, pulling it tightly over my body as if it could somehow protect me. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it would stop, that this was just a nightmare, that when I opened my eyes again, everything would be normal. But when I opened them, the tapping had stopped. I didn't dare look out the window. I couldn't. I could feel its presence there, just beyond the glass, waiting for me to give in. Time passed in a blur. I wasn't sure how long I lay there, trembling under the covers, but eventually the sun began to rise. The first light of day filtered through the curtains, and the oppressive weight in the room lifted, if only slightly. The shadow outside was gone. I thought maybe I had imagined it all, maybe the fear had twisted my mind in the dark. But when I dared to glance at the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a handprint on the glass. A large, smudged handprint right in the middle of the window. It was as though someone, or something, had pressed its hand against the glass, leaving behind a cold, distorted mark. I backed away, my chest tight with panic. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But the handprint remained, a clear, unmistakable sign that I hadn't imagined any of it. The phone was still dead, and now I was more convinced than ever that whatever was happening wasn't something I could explain. It wasn't something I could control. The shadow wasn't just a figment of my imagination, it was real. And it wasn't going away. But the scariest part? It wasn't just watching me anymore. It was waiting. Days passed, but the weight of that moment stayed with me, clinging to every thought, every movement. The handprint on the window had never disappeared. I cleaned it, wiped it with a cloth, but it always returned. The edges of the print became more distinct, more defined, like the glass was remembering. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, tracked, even, by something that knew me better than I knew myself. The phone, however, remained dead. Every time I tried to power it on, it flickered briefly, then went dark again. No matter what I did, it refused to cooperate, leaving me disconnected from the outside world. But the longer it stayed that way, the more I began to believe that whatever was happening wasn't just limited to my apartment. I had become part of something larger. That evening, the shadow returned. I saw it as I had before, shifting outside the window, moving in unnatural ways, like it wasn't constrained by the laws of reality. It seemed to stretch and bend in impossible angles, as if it were testing the limits of the space outside. I stood frozen, unable to tear my eyes away. It was then that I noticed the sound, the faint rustling of fabric. A light scraping noise, as if something was being dragged across the concrete below. I leaned forward, straining to hear better, but the sound disappeared as quickly as it had started. I stepped away from the window, my breath shallow. My heart pounded in my chest, the quiet pressure building once more. The lights in the apartment flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls, as if the very atmosphere was shifting. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for whatever it was to come closer. I decided to leave the apartment. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to be somewhere, anywhere, away from this place. Away from the window that felt like it was keeping me captive. I grabbed my jacket, bolted the door behind me, and descended the stairwell, barely noticing the way the air around me seemed to thicken, as though the building itself were holding its breath. Once outside, the night air hit me like a slap to the face. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the oppressive feeling that had taken hold of me. The streets were quiet, too quiet. No cars, no people, just the distant hum of the city. A few streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the pavement. It was like the entire world had gone still. I wandered aimlessly, my thoughts swirling. What was happening? Why me? And most importantly, how could I stop it? I kept walking, desperate to outrun the terror gnawing at my insides, but every step I took only seemed to bring me closer to the unsettling realization that there was nowhere I could go to escape. After what felt like hours, I found myself standing in front of a small convenience store. I hadn't planned on stopping, but the neon light above the door drew me in like a moth to a flame. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the cool air conditioning hitting my face. The bell above the door jingled softly as I entered, and I glanced around the aisles. A few customers milled about, but it felt like no one was really there. I approached the counter, where an older man stood, staring at the register in a daze. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice quiet. He didn't answer. He didn't even look up. His hands were shaking slightly as he fumbled with the register. I glanced down at the counter and noticed something strange. A phone, old, cracked, the same model as mine, lay there, its screen cracked. Without thinking, I reached for it. It was ice cold to the touch, even though the store was warm. I picked it up, inspecting it, when a strange buzzing filled the air. The register beeped loudly, and the old man snapped out of his trance, his eyes widening as he saw me holding the phone. "That's not for you," he muttered, his voice low but hoarse. "Put it down. It's not yours." I froze, the phone still in my hand. "What do you mean? What's happening to it?" The man stepped back, his face pale. "It doesn't belong here. It shouldn't be here. You don't know what you've done." Suddenly, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I jumped, startled. I had almost forgotten about it, and yet the eerie synchronicity felt wrong. I pulled it out, heart racing, and saw that it had turned on just for a moment. The screen flickered, and there, on the display, was a text message. "You shouldn't have gone out. It's already too late." I dropped the phone in shock, my hands trembling. The store, the man, everything seemed to blur together as a wave of dizziness washed over me. I turned to leave, but as I stepped toward the door, something caught my eye. A shadow, large and dark, cast against the wall. It was moving, and it was heading straight for me. I froze in place, the door handle cold in my hand. The shadow outside the convenience store's window was moving too quickly. It was no longer just a dark figure, but something more defined, stretching and undulating in unnatural ways. It seemed to crawl up the wall like a living thing, its edges blurred as if it was trying to escape the constraints of reality. My heart pounded so loudly I could feel it in my throat. I wasn't sure whether to run or stay, but I couldn't seem to tear my eyes away. The old man, still behind the counter, was staring at me with wide, panicked eyes. "You need to leave now. It knows you're here," he whispered, his voice shaking with fear. I took a step back, my breath coming in short gasps. The air in the store had grown colder, and the shadows inside seemed to shift as if they were alive. The buzzing from my phone still echoed in my ears, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it again. It was as though the shadow outside the window was calling to me, pulling me in with an invisible force I couldn't escape. Then, the door opened. The bell jingled softly, and a man stepped inside, tall, cloaked in dark clothing, his features obscured by a hood. The moment he entered, the shadows in the store seemed to darken even further, as if his very presence sucked the light from the room. He didn't speak, only stood there, watching me. I wanted to ask who he was, but the words stuck in my throat. The weight of his gaze was suffocating. There was something about him, something that didn't belong in this world. It wasn't just his appearance, but the way the atmosphere seemed to warp around him. The entire room felt like it was bending, as though we were no longer in the same reality. I backed away from him, my chest tight with panic. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised one hand and pointed toward the door, where the shadow outside the window had grown even larger. It was now a massive shape, almost human, but not quite, its edges too jagged, its movements too erratic. "You've been marked," the man said in a low, gravelly voice. "You should not have seen it. Now it's following you." My breath caught in my throat as I looked back at the door. The shadow was moving toward the window, stretching up the wall in an impossible manner. I could feel its presence growing stronger, closer. The store seemed to close in on me, the air thickening as the temperature dropped even further. It was as though the world itself was trying to push me out. I turned back to the man, but he was already gone. No sound, no footsteps, just the sudden absence of his presence. It was as though he had never been there at all. I stood there, disoriented, my mind racing. What was happening? Who was that man? And why had he warned me? I didn't have time to answer those questions. The shadow at the window was no longer just a shape, it was moving inside the store, its form creeping along the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It was closing in on me. I turned and bolted for the door, but as my hand reached for the handle, something slammed into the window. The force of it was enough to rattle the glass, and I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. I looked through the window and saw nothing but darkness on the other side. But the shadow was still there. It was inside now. It was in the store. I could hear its movement behind me, a dragging sound, like something heavy scraping across the floor. I spun around, but all I saw was a dark figure, its shape twisted, its limbs stretching unnaturally. It was standing right in front of me now, its face obscured in the blackness. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, smell the stale, metallic scent that filled the air. It didn't move, just stood there, as if waiting. "Leave me alone." I screamed, but the words felt hollow, useless. My voice echoed in the room, swallowed by the thick silence. Then, the shadow stepped forward. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had form. It had substance. It was a thing, alive, watching, and it was here for me. I backed away, my legs weak beneath me, but it followed. Step by step, it drew closer. I could see its features now, though they were distorted and shifting, as if they couldn't decide what they wanted to be. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were glowing faintly, two cold, unblinking orbs that stared into my soul. "Please, stop," I whispered, my voice trembling. But it didn't stop. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, there was a sound, a crack, like the breaking of glass. The shadow jerked backward, as if something had yanked it away. It shuddered violently, its form flickering, like a malfunctioning TV screen. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. I ran out of the store and into the night, not daring to look back. The street was empty now, the world eerily quiet. But I could still feel it, the weight of its presence, the chill in the air, the feeling of being hunted. I didn't know how long I ran or where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stop. But no matter how fast I moved, I could still feel the shadow lurking just behind me, waiting for the moment when it would catch me. I had thought it was over when I left the apartment, but now I knew. The shadow wasn't just confined to that window. It had followed me, and it wouldn't stop until it had me. I don't remember when I stopped running. My body had long since exhausted itself, my legs aching with every step. The night was thick, the kind of dark that feels suffocating, as if the world itself was closing in. The air around me was cold, colder than it should have been, but I couldn't feel it anymore, not with the terror gripping me so tightly. I kept moving, instinctively, driven by the primal fear that if I stopped, if I dared to rest, it would catch me. The shadow, it was still there, still following, its presence pressing on my every step, even though I refused to look back. But I could feel it. I could feel its cold, suffocating breath on my neck, hear the scraping, shifting sound it made as it moved through the night. I had left the convenience store behind, but it didn't matter. It had followed me. It was always with me, just out of sight, just a step behind, a shadow in the corner of my mind. I stumbled through the streets, the distant hum of traffic like a memory I couldn't grasp. The city had never seemed so empty before. I passed building after building, but the world felt wrong, distorted, like a reflection in cracked glass. My phone buzzed again, and for a moment, I almost didn't dare look at it. I was afraid that it might be another warning, another glimpse into something worse. But when I did, I froze. There, on the screen, was a photo. The last one I'd taken before my phone died, before everything went wrong. It was the picture of the shadow behind the window. The one I had tried to capture at the store. Only now, the image was different. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. The thing was visible. Its face, distorted and twisted, its features dark and unnatural, stared back at me from the screen, its eyes wide and glowing with malice. And beneath it, a single message. It's too late. I dropped the phone, my hand shaking. My breath quickened, and I felt a surge of panic that threatened to overtake me. I couldn't escape it. It was here. It was coming for me. I turned to look around, my eyes darting through the empty streets. There was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. The shadow had already claimed this place, just as it had claimed my life. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. My own voice. You shouldn't have looked. The words echoed around me, coming from all directions at once, as if the shadow had infiltrated my very thoughts. It was no longer just following me. It was inside my head. I started to back away, heart pounding in my chest, but the darkness around me seemed to close in tighter with each step. The air was thick, and the streets stretched longer than they should have. I was trapped in a maze of shadows, with no way out. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the shadow, no longer an indistinct shape, but a tangible thing, standing in the middle of the street. Its form was unmistakable now, tall, towering, its limbs stretched impossibly long. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a mask of darkness, hollow eyes staring straight at me, unblinking. You've seen too much. The voice wasn't just mine anymore. It was distorted, corrupted, filled with a deep, resonant hum that rattled my bones. It was the shadow, speaking through me, using my voice to mock me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. My body felt heavy, my mind clouded with fear, as though every thought was being consumed by the darkness that surrounded me. And then it moved. The shadow lunged forward with unnatural speed, its long arms reaching out for me. It was too fast, too close. I couldn't escape. I couldn't breathe. In that moment, I realized there was no escape. No way to outrun it. The shadow had followed me all along, and now it had caught me. As it reached for me, everything went cold. The world tilted, and I felt myself falling, plummeting into an abyss of darkness. The ground beneath me disappeared, and I screamed, but there was no sound, no air. The last thing I saw was the shadow's face, inches from mine, its hollow eyes reflecting nothing but the deepest black. And then, nothing. I woke up. The world around me was unchanged. I was standing on the same street, the same empty, darkened city. The phone was in my hand again, its screen cracked, its battery dead. I blinked, confused. Had it all been a dream? Had this shadow been a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind? I couldn't tell. But then, a chill ran down my spine. I looked up, and there it was. The shadow, standing across the street, watching me. And I realized something with a sickening certainty. It was not the end. It was only the beginning. Have you ever seen someone in a photo, someone you know shouldn't be there? Someone you don't recognize, yet their face feels too familiar? That's how it started for me. It was a Sunday afternoon when I was going through the old family albums. My grandmother had passed away, and my mom had asked me to help sort through some of her things. Most of the pictures were from a time long before I was born, faces I had heard about in stories but had never met. My grandmother was always so full of stories, but now that she was gone, the faces in the photos seemed to carry a weight that none of them had before. I remember flipping through one of the albums when something caught my eye. It was a photo I didn't recognize. I had seen most of these before, but not this one. It was a picture of my grandmother and my grandfather standing on the porch of their old house. Behind them, there was a man. At first, I thought it was just some distant relative, but the more I looked at him, the more unsettled I became. His face was out of focus, as though it didn't belong in the picture at all. His features were blurred, distorted, as if the camera had failed to capture him properly. His eyes, though, those were clear. Those eyes were staring directly at the camera, directly at me. There was something unsettling about them, too intense, too aware. I flipped the page, trying to push away the strange feeling creeping up my spine. But the image lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the photo was looking at me, waiting. That night, I tried to forget about the photo. It was just a blurry, poorly taken picture, nothing more. At least, that's what I told myself. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. His eyes were still staring, burning into me from the shadows of my mind. I couldn't understand why I was so bothered. It was just a photo, after all. But something about it felt wrong. The next day, I was sitting in the kitchen, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a knock on the door. It was mid-afternoon, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I walked over to the door and peered through the peephole. At first, I saw nothing. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure standing at the edge of my porch. A man. He was wearing a long coat, and his face was obscured by the shadows. I could just make out his outline, but there was something about him that made my heart race. His stance was unnerving, as if he was waiting for something. I froze. I didn't know who he was. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't seem to move. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a soft voice. A voice that sounded too familiar. "Hello, I'm here to talk to you," the voice said. It was calm, almost too calm. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't recognize the voice, but there was something in it that struck me deep within. It was as though I had heard it before, somewhere, but I couldn't place it. I took a step back from the door. My pulse was racing. Who was this man? How did he know where I lived? And why did his voice feel so hauntingly familiar? Then it hit me. The photo. I quickly ran to my living room and grabbed the album, flipping through the pages until I found it. The picture of my grandmother and grandfather, with the man standing behind them. His face was blurry, distorted, but the eyes were clear. And now I understood. The eyes were the same eyes staring back at me from the porch. I rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain to look outside. The man was still standing there, right where I had seen him. But this time, he wasn't just standing, he was looking directly at me. His face was no longer obscured by shadows. It was him, the man from the photo. I felt my blood run cold as I stepped back from the window. What was happening? How could this be real? The doorbell rang again. This time, it was more insistent, almost desperate. I didn't answer. But that didn't stop him. The knock came again, and then the sound changed. It wasn't a knock anymore. It was a scratching, like nails dragging against the wood. Slowly, deliberately. The sound sent a shiver through me, every scratch reverberating in the silence of the house. I pressed my back to the wall, trying to steady my breathing. I knew I should call the police. I knew I should do something. But my mind kept drifting back to the photo. To the eyes. The man had been in that picture long before I had seen him standing outside. And now, here he was. I needed to make sure he wasn't just some illusion. I needed to prove that this wasn't happening. I grabbed my phone and took a quick photo through the peephole, praying that the screen would give me some sense of clarity. I stepped back, looking at the image. My hands were shaking as I zoomed in. But the picture was different now. The man was still there, standing at my door. But this time, his face wasn't blurry. It was clear, too clear. And in the reflection of the glass, behind him, was my own face, staring back at me. I dropped the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. I stood there, frozen, my heart racing in my chest. My mind couldn't process what I had just seen. It didn't make sense. The man outside my door, his face had become crystal clear, but it wasn't just his face that terrified me. It was the reflection behind him. My own reflection. How could that be? How could my face be behind him while I was standing on the other side of the house, peeking through the peephole? I couldn't understand it. It didn't add up. And yet, there it was. My own face, staring at me with a strange, cold expression, as if it weren't my own at all. I stumbled back from the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. My eyes flicked to the phone on the floor, still showing the image. I reached down, hands shaking, and picked it up again. The reflection in the glass was clearer now. It wasn't just the outline of me, it was my full face, staring back with eyes wide in shock, just like mine. I quickly shut off the phone, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My hands were clammy, and my mind raced to make sense of what I had just seen. I wasn't sure if I was losing my mind or if something truly strange was happening right in front of me. The knock came again. A soft, insistent tap on the door that made my skin crawl. But this time, I didn't just hear it. It felt wrong, as if the knock was echoing in my bones. I backed away from the door, my legs feeling weak beneath me. My eyes kept darting to the window, but I couldn't bring myself to look. What if he was still there? What if that reflection was real? The scratching sound started up again. Slow, deliberate, dragging against the doorframe. It felt like something was trying to claw its way inside. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the noise, but it only got louder, sharper. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this house, away from whatever this was. I ran for my phone, trying to call someone, anyone. But as I fumbled with the screen, it flickered and then went black. No signal. Nothing. I swiped frantically, but it was useless. My phone was dead. I looked around the apartment, my eyes landing on the front door. The locks. I had checked them earlier, but now they didn't seem secure enough. Nothing felt secure. There was a sudden gust of wind that rattled the windows. A cold draft swept through the room, sending a shiver through my body. It was too cold, colder than it should have been for a warm afternoon. And yet, the air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I grabbed my keys and moved towards the door, my hands still shaking. But before I could unlock it, the scratching sound stopped. Silence. I pressed my ear against the door. I couldn't hear anything on the other side. No footsteps. No breathing. No sign that anyone had been there at all. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined everything. Maybe the photo, the knocking, the scratching, it had all been a product of my overactive mind. A combination of stress and grief over my grandmother's passing. But then I heard it. A voice. Soft, almost a whisper. The voice I had heard earlier, the one I had felt so uneasy about. It was coming from the other side of the door. "Open the door," the voice said. It was calm, almost soothing. But something about it made my skin crawl. "Let me in." I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape. But my feet were glued to the floor. Something in the voice kept me rooted, paralyzed with fear. I took a step back, my hand hovering over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I didn't know what I'd find if I did. The voice came again, a little louder this time. "Open the door, it's time." My heart was racing now, hammering against my ribs. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. To do something. But I couldn't move. I couldn't think clearly. I ran to the window, hoping for a glimpse of something outside that could explain this madness. The wind had died down, and the street below looked empty, just like it always had. There was no one there. No man standing in the shadows. No reflection of me staring back from the glass. I felt a strange relief, like I had somehow escaped whatever was haunting me. But that feeling didn't last. The reflection. The photo. The voice. It all came flooding back. And then I saw it. In the glass, behind me, a shadow shifted. It wasn't my own. It was tall, featureless, and it moved slowly, like it was waiting for me to turn around. I spun, but the room was empty. No shadow. No figure. I was losing my mind. I had to be. But why did it feel so real? Why did it feel like I wasn't alone? I felt trapped, as if the walls were closing in on me, the air growing heavier by the second. The knock came again. This time, it wasn't just a knock. It was a pounding. A desperate banging against the door. A frantic urgency that made my heart lurch in my chest. "Let me in," the voice shouted. "Let me in now." I staggered back from the door, fear rising in my throat like bile. I knew one thing for certain now: whatever was outside, whatever had been in that photo, wasn't human. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The door started to shake with each hit, and the windows rattled. The house felt like it was closing in on me. I had to do something. But what? What was I supposed to do when the world around me seemed to unravel? When the man in the photo was no longer just a stranger in the background, but a real threat standing at my door? I took a deep breath, forced myself to move. But the door didn't just open. The walls did. The ground seemed to tremble beneath me as the room shifted, as if the very walls were bending toward me, collapsing inwards. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound drowning out everything else. I stumbled back, away from the door, but the walls kept moving, stretching, pushing in. I could feel the air growing thick, heavier, as if something was closing in on me from every side. It was too much. I couldn't breathe. I needed to escape, but where could I go? There was nowhere left. My mind raced, thoughts jumbled and erratic, as I felt the walls squeezing tighter and tighter. The temperature dropped suddenly, the chill biting at my skin as the sound of the pounding on the door grew louder, frantic. I could almost hear it in my bones now, a rhythmic force, shaking the very foundation of the apartment. And then, as I pressed my back against the cold, suffocating wall, it stopped. The knocking. The shaking. Everything. I opened my eyes, not even realizing I had closed them. The apartment was silent again, but it was different. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. I looked around, but it was as though I was in a different place altogether. The walls had shifted in ways that defied reason, stretching far beyond the space I knew, casting strange shadows in corners that shouldn't have existed. The room seemed wrong, but in ways I couldn't articulate. Like a distorted version of the one I had lived in for years. I took a step forward. The floor creaked beneath me, like a hollow shell of wood and stone. I glanced over at the door, but there was no shadow anymore. No man. No reflection. Yet, the image of the man in the photo kept flashing in my mind, his eyes burned into my thoughts, cold and distant. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just a passing unease, it was something deeper, more suffocating, as if invisible eyes were studying me, waiting for me to make the next move. But where could I go? Where was safe? The feeling intensified, like fingers of ice curling around my spine. I spun, searching for anything that might offer an explanation, but there was nothing. Just the walls, slowly folding in, pressing me toward the center of the room. That's when I heard it. A whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. It was barely audible, but it was there. Turn around. I froze. My body went rigid, my breath caught in my throat. The voice wasn't from outside the room this time, it was inside. Inside my head, inside the room, all around me. It didn't matter. It felt the same. The fear was the same. I had no choice but to turn. And there he was. The man from the photo. He was standing in the middle of the room, his tall figure looming, bathed in the strange, flickering light that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. His eyes met mine with an unsettling familiarity. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape this nightmare, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, my breath shallow, my pulse a wild rhythm in my ears. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. Every step he took echoed in my mind like a hammer strike. He wasn't just a man. He was something else. Something that had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for me. Did you think you could escape? His voice was cold, distant, like the wind howling through the cracks of a broken house. It wasn't just a voice, it was a command. An order. Something that held power. I opened my mouth to respond, to say anything, but the words caught in my throat. I tried to back away, but my legs refused to cooperate. The air felt thick, almost viscous, as if I were moving through water. I reached for the door, but it wasn't where it should have been. The walls were shifting again, disorienting me, trapping me. I was in the center of a maze with no way out. "Don't run," he said softly, as if reading my thoughts. "You can't outrun what's already inside you." The words felt like a weight pressing against my chest. I struggled to breathe, to understand. What did he mean? What was inside me? The man raised his hand, a slow, deliberate movement as though to touch the air itself. And then, the walls, they stopped. The movement ceased, and the room settled. The pressure in the air lifted, just enough for me to catch my breath. But it wasn't over. I looked at the photo in my mind again. The man wasn't just in the background this time. He was standing there, his eyes locked onto mine, his face not just a distant stranger, but a mirror. A shadow moved at the corner of my eye, and I looked down. The reflection wasn't just in my mind anymore, it was on the floor beneath me, stretching from my feet like a dark stain. I was staring at myself, but it wasn't me. It was him. The man. He was me, standing in the reflection. "Why do you think it's only you who can see this?" the man asked, his voice deepening into something darker, more dangerous. I shook my head, a wave of nausea overwhelming me. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But as I looked into the reflection again, I saw the truth. He was becoming me. The lines of his face blurred into mine, his eyes sinking into mine, the walls closing in tighter. I wasn't the one being watched anymore. I was the one staring back. And the room, my apartment, was no longer my own. It had become a cage. The man was inside me now, and there was no escaping that. I could feel the floor beneath me shifting, the entire apartment warping like something out of a dream. No, this wasn't a dream. This was real. The air around me had turned thick and dense, almost suffocating, as if the room itself were tightening its grip. I turned to face the mirror again, the reflection warping further. My own face seemed to stretch unnaturally, features distorting until they weren't my own anymore. The eyes staring back at me weren't mine. They were his. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, but the world around me felt like it was closing in. I couldn't breathe. My legs refused to support me. The room, my sanctuary, had become an unrecognizable place. I was trapped in a version of reality that no longer felt stable. Nothing made sense anymore. The man, the thing that looked like me, stepped closer to the mirror. His movements were slow, deliberate. His smile twisted, mocking. I couldn't look away. Something about his presence was pulling me in, like a force I couldn't fight. My mind screamed, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed, caught between the nightmare and whatever reality this had become. Do you feel it? His voice was deep, almost purring in my ear, even though he hadn't moved. This is your world now. This is what you've become. Trapped, staring at yourself from the outside, wondering how it all slipped away. His words were like ice, freezing my thoughts, sending shivers down my spine. The room around me flickered, changing with every breath. The windows that once offered a view of the city were now black, like empty voids. I couldn't hear the usual sounds of the street anymore. No cars, no footsteps. Silence. The silence was deafening. I turned, my eyes frantically scanning the room. The photo, the one that had started all of this, my photo, lay on the floor, face down. I crawled toward it, feeling the cold floor press against my palms. My breath hitched as I picked it up, turning it over. And there he was again. The man, standing in the background, his face expressionless, eyes dark. But this time, the photo seemed different. It wasn't just a picture. It was alive. The edges of the photo flickered like a broken television screen, and the shadows in the corners of the image shifted. I blinked and it was as if the picture was breathing. The man's eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, unyielding. I dropped the photo, my hands trembling. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the thick air. I reached for my phone, still broken, screen shattered from earlier. It lay on the floor next to me, a lifeless shell. I couldn't escape. There was no one I could call. No one helped me. The room seemed to contract even more, walls pressing in, and I felt myself being drawn closer to the mirror again. Why don't you understand? His voice was close now, behind me. I spun, but no one was there. He was always there, always just a breath away, waiting. You can't run from this. You never could. His laugh echoed in the room, bouncing off the walls like a distorted, cruel melody. It was mocking, taunting me. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the laughter didn't stop. It never stopped. I opened my eyes again, my hand clutching the edge of the dresser as I tried to steady myself. The walls, the floor, the windows, none of it was real anymore. It was all a twisted reflection. The man was everywhere. Inside me. Around me. And then I realized something terrifying. I was him now. The realization struck me like a lightning bolt. I reached for the mirror, my hand trembling as it met the cool glass. The reflection that stared back wasn't my own, it was his. His face, his eyes, his smile. I wasn't in control anymore. I had become the man in the photo. The one who had been watching me. The one who had always been me. A final scream clawed at my throat, but it was drowned out by the suffocating silence. I was alone, but not really. I could feel him there, in me, his presence, his breath. And the world was collapsing around me. The glass beneath my fingers began to crack, and I pulled my hand away as the mirror shattered, its pieces falling to the floor like broken fragments of my sanity. But even with the mirror gone, I could still feel him watching me. I could feel him inside me, tugging at the edges of my thoughts. The room was gone now. The walls were gone. Everything was nothing. I was alone. Or, at least, I thought I was. But then I heard it again. The soft, insidious whisper. The voice that had been haunting me. It spoke from the very air itself, from within the silence, from within the darkness. You can never escape, you know. There's nowhere to hide. You'll always be me, and I'll always be you. And as the darkness pressed in, I realized that this was the end. There would be no rescue. No way out. There was only the man in the photo. Always there. Always waiting. And now, he was me. The reflection had swallowed me whole. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.